We're pleased this time to be addressing the important topic of crime and violence in the Caribbean. From our perspective, of course, as well as everybody in the region, crime continues to be an ongoing issue that needs to have close attention paid to it. And we're pleased to have some distinguished academics with us today who are going to be talking about the study that the IDB has recently launched, Restoring Paradise in the Caribbean, and it's combating violence with numbers. I'm not going to say too much. I just want to welcome everybody who's taking the time this morning to listen in and be a part of this broadcast. With us via video, we have Dr. Ed Maguire, who's professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. With us in CCAA's offices, we have Heather Sutton, who is the lead researcher for Institutions and Development Department at the Inter-American Development Bank. And we have Moises Schwartz, who is the Caribbean Regional Economic Advisor in the Caribbean Country Department of the Inter-American Development Bank. So I'm going to turn it over to the panelists, and we'll start with the study author, Heather Sutton. So, Heather, we can turn it over to you.
Great, wonderful. Let's see if we can get the presentation up here for everyone to see.
There we go. Can you share this is?
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. This is a quote that I like to start with because I think it's a proper motivation behind this research. If you can't measure it, you cannot improve it. And this is really, as I said, the driving motivation behind some data generation and knowledge activities that the IDB has been undertaking with governments of the Caribbean over the last several years. So what do we know about violence, crime and violence in the Caribbean? We know that, I'm not clicking, but it's not moving to the next slide.
Is it the other, is it the right click?
Perhaps. Maybe you can just, yeah, just do one click. Apologies for the technical difficulties here. Let's see if we can move through. So what do we actually know about crime and violence in the Caribbean? Well, most of the research that has been done uses homicide rates, which are comparable between countries across the world. It's the one type of data that we have that you can really compare. And we know that we see in the Caribbean some of the highest homicide rates, particularly in Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and the Bahamas. And the homicide rate in the region has roughly doubled over the last 2 years. But beyond that, for other types of crime, we don't really know much, and that is due to some severe data limitations, some of which are unique to the Caribbean, and others which are more universal obstacles to measuring and understanding crime and violence. And one of those is that a lot of studies are based on police data. And this is useful in many ways, but it gives only a partial view of the problem due to underreporting of crimes. So our research finds, for example, that only about 53% of the crimes that we measured were reported to the police. So what has the IDB been doing over the last few years? We started with a baseline mapping initiative to try to compile administrative data from various sources, police, public health, social services, etc., and an inventory of relevant policies and programs in place in each country. Then we have conducted a victimization survey module, which was added to the Latin American Public Opinion Poll survey, and did an oversample in capital metropolitan areas. So the results are focused in capital metropolitan areas for this study, along with a business victimization survey, which asks businesses about their experiences with crime and violence. And those are largely the data sources for this publication that we'll be discussing today. But I did want to highlight two other ongoing initiatives. One is the rollout of women's health surveys across the region, which is the best recommended way to understand and measure violence against women, crimes of intimate partner violence, and sexual violence. And also a series of prison surveys that we'll be working on in the next year or so. But within this publication, we look at essentially three questions. First of all, is the Caribbean unique in some way? And because we now have victimization survey data, excuse me, we can compare across countries within the region. We've covered 5 countries in our study here with victimization surveys. And we can also compare with the international database of around 70 cities around the world. And we do find essentially that crime in the Caribbean is unique, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. We looked at some of the costs of crime, the public, private, and social costs, and what are some of the drivers or the factors associated with crime. And finally, what can be done? So let's move forward. Is the Caribbean unique? And I mentioned to you that we find, yes, the Caribbean is unique. We see that in the Caribbean, property crimes, for example, are lower or on par with global averages, but violent crime is particularly high in the Caribbean. So what you're looking at here on the screen are the prevalence rates, or the percent of the population that was victimized in a 1-year period for different types of crime. On the left, we have property crimes, which don't involve the use of force or threat, and on the right, violent crimes, which do involve the use of force and threat. And you'll see, for example, theft, which is pickpocketing or theft of personal items without the use of force. The global average was far higher than actually the C5, which is the Caribbean 5 that where our victimization surveys were implemented. Burglary is about on par with global averages. What really stands out is essentially assault and threat, this crime on the right-hand side, a violent crime, which is attacks or physical attacks or threats of physical attacks. And you see there that the Caribbean 5 are far higher than global averages. And down below you can see a bit of the interregional variance for the 5 metropolitan areas that we looked at. So with Bridgetown and Paramaribo from Suriname and Barbados having lower rates, but you'll see that some of those countries, in fact, are even higher than the Caribbean average, and some of the highest ever registered in the International Crime Database. This is just a look based on regions. So of those 70 countries that I mentioned around the world that have done international crime victimization surveys, we can see again on the top left-hand corner, the Caribbean, which is the red bar, is the lowest rates for theft, but we've got the Caribbean as having the highest rates of any region for assault and threat. Robbery and burglary are somewhere in between. In terms of indirect victimization, we see that nearly 1 in 3, yeah, 1 in 3 respondents stated that they had lost someone to violence, which is fairly shocking, and 1 in 3 had witnessed a serious attack, shooting, or beating sometime in their lives. And if you look to the left, you can see again the interregional variance with Kingston, for example, Kingston metropolitan area, almost half of the population having lost someone to violence. So we're really talking about highly traumatized societies here. What do we know about this, particularly the violent crime? Well, most of it is occurring within the victim's own neighborhood and by someone that they know. About 66% of the assaults and threats that we measured were within the victim's own neighborhood or their home, and this is keeping in mind that we intentionally excluded domestic violence. So domestic violence is not included in this. 73% of assault victims said that they knew their offender, and about 30% of those assaults resulted in victims seeking medical attention. So who are the victims? Largely male victims in terms of violent crime. Property crime, it's really, the difference between males and females is insignificant if you look at theft and burglary on the left. versus robbery and assault and threat on the right, particularly for that crime of assault and threat, which we find particularly high in the Caribbean. You see that the male victimization rates are far higher than female rates. And this is to be expected because, again, we're measuring crimes within the public domain, whereas women are more likely to be victims of other types of sexual violence or intimate partner violence. Also, the victimization rates for youth in the category of 18 to 30 years old are far higher in terms of violent crime. Again, looking at that category of assault and threat, we can see that 11% of youth in that age category were victimized by assault and threat in a one-year period in the Caribbean, which is almost double the international average. Then when we look at income, for example, on the left-hand chart you're seeing the Caribbean, and the right is the International Crime Victimization Survey's averages. We're looking at the income quartiles, so as we move from left to right, you're going through the lower income ranges. And what's interesting here, again, is for that crime of assault and threat, which is the green line heading, we see that it's increasing very much, significantly in the lower income quartiles, whereas we don't necessarily see the same trend for the international crime victimization surveys in other countries around the world. Okay, so what are some of the costs of crime then? The IDB recently put out a new study of 17 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, including 4 Caribbean countries. And this study applies a methodology, an accounting methodology, to estimate the cost of crime in 17 countries. And what you're seeing here is the Caribbean, the upper bound estimate, versus at the top the Latin American and Caribbean average for those 17 countries, and then 6 other developed countries using the same methodology. So what we see is that the cost in the Caribbean is somewhere between 2.4 and 3.7% of GDP annually, and that includes broken down components of government expenditure, private costs, or what businesses and individuals spend on private security, and social costs of crime, which includes foregone income for prisoners, foregone income of homicide victims, and income or costs related to injury, etc. We also see that the Caribbean, amongst the 17 countries, has the highest costs after Central America, and that within those 17 countries, the Caribbean had the highest government expenditure on crime. So what are Caribbean governments spending on? Again, at the top bar, you're looking at, this is the Latin American and Caribbean average for 17 countries compared to the various countries that were included in the study. So you'll see that for prisons, the Caribbean spends more than the Latin American and Caribbean average. Also for police, Caribbean is spending more, but it's spending far less on judiciary, which is already low amongst the 17 Latin American and Caribbean countries. We also looked at some indirect costs, for example, intentions to immigrate, and we find that those who are victims of a crime twice or more in the last year had higher intentions to immigrate, the dark blue bar versus the green bar, which is for non-victims. And they also showed higher dissatisfaction with life. In terms of some of the drivers that we looked at, considering that the Caribbean suffers particularly and intensely from violent crime within the victim's neighborhood and by someone that they know, we looked at some of the factors that are associated with that violent crime. First of all, violence starts in the home. We know from international literature that there's much evidence that cycles of violence begin in the home when children witness the abuse of their mothers and or experience violence for themselves in the home. So while we don't have good data on victimization of children and women in the Caribbean yet, we're still working on this, we do, from this survey, have some data on attitudes around use of violence in the home. And we see that, for example, 1 in 3 individuals would understand hitting a wife who is unfaithful. And this is compared to, it's significantly higher than the Latin American average or the United States. About 78% of respondents said it was necessary to physically discipline a child, again higher than the Latin American average, and 88% of respondents admitted to suffering corporal punishment themselves as a child, again higher than the Latin American average or the United States. We looked at risk factors for youth that are often tied in the literature to a higher propensity for offending or perpetuating violence. And we find this, what you're looking at here is actually using data from the Global School Health Surveys. You're comparing Latin America to the Caribbean, and we find that, for example, sexual initiation, early sexual initiation, fighting, and substance abuse were far higher in terms of prevalence across between Caribbean and Latin American averages. They're higher in the Caribbean. And engaged parenting, which would be a protective factor, much lower in the Caribbean. Also, victims live in neighborhoods with higher levels, which they deem to have higher levels of disorder and social cohesion or trust amongst neighbors. So asking victims, we asked all of the respondents to rate their neighborhoods and created some indexes. And what you're looking at here is the difference between victims and non-victims. So victims had much higher scores for neighborhood disorder, that's sort of graffiti, trash, abandoned buildings, and lower levels of social cohesion or trust amongst neighbors. Interestingly, informal social control, which is the willingness of neighbors to get involved in a conflict or something that's occurring in the neighborhood, was slightly lower, but it was statistically insignificant. Victims also have a higher propensity to say that there is a gang presence in their neighborhood. So across the region, about 33% of individuals in capital metropolitan areas said that there was a gang presence in their neighborhood. This is higher amongst assault victims, as you can see. And last but not least, the tools of violence. So in terms of the use of firearms across the region, we see that a gun was used twice as often in crimes in the 5 Caribbean metropolitan areas that we looked at compared to the international average. That's about 35% of all robberies and 17% of assaults. Therefore, given the high rates of assault already, your likelihood of being assaulted at gunpoint in the Caribbean was about 3 times higher than the international average. And homicides are also the main weapon used guns are also the main weapon used in homicides in the Caribbean, much more often than internationally. Looking at some of the institutions that are designed to provide deterrence, we find that, interestingly, the Caribbean has relatively high satisfaction rates with the police. What you're looking at on the left is an index of how people rated their satisfaction with the police performance in their neighborhood, and you see the Bahamas up there, for example, very high. However, this does not necessarily, and partially this may be related to high police population density ratios. In the Caribbean, we have some of the highest ratio of police to population in the world. Bahamas, for example, I think is amongst the 4 highest in the world. And however, this does not necessarily translate into higher effectiveness of the police forces. We do see fairly low detection rates across the Caribbean, with the Bahamas having some of the highest for homicide. For example, about 50% of homicides were detected in the Bahamas, given our data. But on the lower end, Trinidad and Tobago, about only 14% of homicides were detected the last year the data was available. In terms of the courts, there's relatively little systematic data collection on what's happening with court cases, but we do know from our country reports there's relatively low conviction rates. We see high court case dismissals and long backlogs, sometimes that can go up to for years, which then contributes to a situation in our corrections and prisons where there are high incarceration rates, overcrowding in the prisons, and large percentage of the population that is still awaiting trial. So about 42% of the prison populations at the countries that we had data for were waiting for trial. So on to the conclusions and then recommendations. In the report, we have an entire chapter dedicated to reviewing international evidence on what works to reduce crime compared to what is currently being done in the Caribbean. While there's little in the way of rigorously evaluated programs and interventions in the Caribbean right now, there's certainly some potentially promising programs that we look forward to seeing more analysis and more research on. And those include, for example, in terms of prevention. In Jamaica, we know that the best prevention programs target high-risk beneficiaries. And in Jamaica, we have an initiative that the IDB has been helping support, which is designing risk assessment tools for youth and basing a whole plan of services for those high-risk youth around their key risk profiles. We also see evidence-based programs being implemented and evaluated in Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica. Perhaps Dr. Maguire will talk a bit about the Cure Violence initiative in Trinidad and Tobago that he's been following closely. In terms of police, one really good example of promising initiative is with the Trinidad and Tobago police force that has undergone a randomized control trial of their hotspot policing initiative. So hotspot policing focuses patrols on those hotspots where crimes are occurring. And in Trinidad and Tobago, we find, for example, that 3% of street segments are concentrating about 50% of crimes. So it's concentrated patrolling at certain times of day in certain areas, and they've done a randomized control trial to see how effective that has been, and the data from that has been feeding back into the police force. In terms of the justice system, we see some promising initiatives in the Bahamas and Barbados to improve court administration systems, court scheduling systems, and to reduce backlogs. There's also some initiatives, for example, in Jamaica, to divert youth and nonviolent offenders away from the formal criminal justice system into alternatives, and some use of initial experimenting with prevention courts, predominantly in terms of mental health and substance abuse in Trinidad and Tobago and the Bahamas. And finally, in terms of prisons, some important initiatives to reform and restructure parole systems in the Bahamas and Trinidad and Tobago, more use of alternative sentences, including restorative justice in Jamaica, and some initial rehabilitation and reentry initiatives in Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados. So that said, the conclusions and recommendations are the following. Again, we see in the Caribbean relatively high levels of violent crime with firearms committed in the victim's neighborhood and by people they know. And this type of violence, we understand, requires both prevention and control. It's a false dilemma to say that we need more police in the street or we need more, better education. What we really need is smart prevention and smart crime control programs. And the current situation as is that prevention programs particularly are understaffed, under-resourced, and under-evaluated. So this really means bolstering some of the prevention programs across the region and recognizing them as proven and effective means to reduce violence. Interventions need to be targeted to key individuals and or geographic areas. So we know that crime is not random and it's not everywhere. There's a small amount of high-risk individuals that are concentrated in certain geographic areas. If we're targeting both prevention and control programs, then we're making the best use of resources. And this is not always politically easy, of course. Would-be beneficiaries that don't meet high-risk criteria may be unsatisfied. Taxpayers in low-crime areas may be unsatisfied. And it takes really skilled leadership and communication to communicate this to the public. Finally, interventions should be evidence-based and tested. There is a sort of a moral imperative in a resource-scarce environment to use evidence-based programs that have shown promising, results in other contexts, and also to be testing these interventions in real and meaningful ways where they can fail, so that we know what is working and what is not working, and resources can be readjusted and allocated to those programs that really are having the results that we want. Last but not least, we recommend that governments work on having better indicators to monitor across the criminal justice system, so creating a sort of crime dashboard from the police to the courts to the prison systems, looking at how many crimes are detected, how many arrests are made for what types of crimes, through the court systems, how those cases proceed, and then who are our prison population, so that the bottlenecks can be better addressed. And that's about it. I'm happy to answer any questions and looking forward to a good discussion with you all.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Heather. And I think now we'll turn to Professor Maguire. Again, Professor Maguire is in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University.
Okay, so I'm on. All right, thank you very much. And let me just start by congratulating Heather and all the others involved in the preparation of this report. The one thing that's very clear from reading this report is that it's a really ambitious and I'm sure very time-consuming effort. And so I just want to start off by saying congratulations to everybody involved in the preparation of the report. And I think it's a really important accomplishment, and I'll give you just a bit of context. So I started doing research in the Caribbean in 2004. So I've been at this now for about 13 years. For much of that time, I have struggled, I guess is probably a good word, to find data. Everything that I do as a criminologist involves using data to diagnose crime problems, to develop potential solutions, and then of course using data to test those solutions to determine whether they're effective, and if not, how they can be tweaked and so forth. And so data are really the foundation of what we do as criminologists. And so for virtually the entire time that I've been working in the Caribbean over the past 13 years, we have been in search of good data. And a lot of times what that has meant has literally been things like taking photographs of log books. For instance, I remember being in the Homicide Bureau of Investigations in the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service and literally taking photographs of every page in the logbook listing the homicides, and then taking those photographs back to my hotel room or back to my office and turning them into databases so that we could analyze data so that we could detect patterns. 13 years later, the situation is quite a bit rosier. We have governments in the region investing more heavily in creating good data. But then we have things like this report, where we have victimization surveys that are very carefully done that help us detect important patterns that are actionable that we can use to make good decisions about how to move forward in designing interventions to solve these really serious problems. We could spend all day talking about the reports because, or about the findings in the report, because they are numerous. But I just want to go over a few highlights that I think are worth mentioning. One of the key highlights that we find, and this is similar to what we find in victimization reports elsewhere in the world, as Heather mentioned, is that 53% of crimes reported in these Caribbean countries, or I'm sorry, that 53% of crimes are reported to police in these nations. And so I think that right there illustrates the great value of conducting victimization surveys and not doing so in a one-off effort, to do so over time so that we can begin to amass longitudinal data on victimization, so we can tell if things are getting better, if things are getting worse, and in what ways those trends are happening. Another finding that I want to point out is, as Heather mentioned, that property crime is lower or on par with global averages, but that violence is uniquely high. And this is something that research has demonstrated over the past decade, that the Caribbean, and Latin America for that matter, but that the Caribbean, which is our focus today, really has a significant violence problem. It's not necessarily a general crime problem, but it's really more particularly a violence problem, and that's something that I think is really important for helping us focus our efforts on that issue specifically. Another finding that I thought was really interesting and important is that the rate of victimization by assault and threat is significantly higher than in any other world region, including Latin America. You know, it's really striking to me sometimes when I visit Caribbean nations. They're so beautiful, right? You're standing on the beach, looking out at the water, meeting these amazing people with these beautiful cultures, that these amazing, beautiful places, these places that are so rich in culture, can be suffering from such a really problematic set of issues with regard to violence. And so I think this report is helpful for really emphasizing that there's a violence problem in this region and that it's very significant and worthy of our attention. Another finding that I think is just almost mind-boggling, if you think about it in human terms, is that about a quarter of people in the region have lost someone they felt close to due to violence in their lifetime. I mean, that's a really, really dramatic statement that I think, again, helps emphasize how important it is for us to help this region develop solutions and test those solutions. Heather also mentioned in her presentation a finding which is fairly common worldwide, but I think it's useful to highlight it here, and that's that 3% of street segments, I believe this was in Trinidad and Tobago, have about 50% of crimes concentrated in them. I've done some work on spatial concentrations of violence in Trinidad and Tobago, and we see at all levels, whether we're looking at sort of macro geographic levels or really micro geographic levels at the street segment, we find really dramatic concentrations of violence in Trinidad, and I know that there's been some similar work done in other Caribbean nations, including especially in Jamaica. And so this, again, is a really actionable finding, because rather than thinking about crime as being this generalizable problem, right, it can seem almost too big to take on when we think about it in that way. But when we start thinking about these concentrations of crime, things become a lot more actionable, right? So instead of thinking about how to achieve a really dramatic police presence in every neighborhood, instead it becomes, how do we concentrate police presence and other interventions in the neighborhoods or in the street segments where they can have the greatest effect, because that's where the crime is occurring. And other research in the Caribbean demonstrates similar concentrations of crime in other ways, and so we have concentrations in people, as the report points out, both in victims and in offenders. We have repeat lots of evidence of repeat offenders in the Caribbean and lots of evidence of repeat victimization, both of which are highly actionable. We can design interventions around dealing with repeat offenders and repeat victims. One of the things that hasn't gotten a lot of attention but is really worthy of attention in the region is concentrations in certain groups. And so we know that the Caribbean has not just a violence problem, but a gang violence problem. But here's an interesting pattern that I think is worthy of attention. And that is not all gangs are equally involved in violence, either as those who are carrying out violence or those who are violently victimized. Certain gangs are much more involved in violence than others. And then when we look inside of gangs, we find again concentrations where not everybody in gangs is carrying out violence. You have a certain, typically a small proportion of gang members who are responsible for most of, in the Caribbean, what we're talking about primarily is shootings. And so you have a certain proportion of gangs who are involved in violence, and within gangs, a certain proportion, a pretty small proportion of people who are involved as shooters. So once again, all of this evidence helps point us in a direction of really concentrating our efforts on where we can be most effective, on those people, places, groups, times where we see the most significant concentrations, not just in crime, but as this report points out, in violence, which is, I think, the unique problem in the Caribbean. And so all of this takes us to the question of how is it that we make policy and how is it that we implement crime prevention practices in the Caribbean. And one of the things that I think, this can certainly be said of the United States where I live, which is, you know, it's very difficult to put in place evidence-informed solutions. And there is always, anywhere you go, going to be a lot of resistance to using scientific evidence as a basis for altering how the agencies of justice carry out their work. And over the past 13 years, I've certainly detected in the Caribbean a fairly vehement level of resistance to implementing evidence-informed practices. And why is that? I think one reason is people just get set in their ways about how they do the work that they do. It's very difficult to break people's work-related patterns, even if you can demonstrate that the work that they're doing is not really effective in reducing crime or violence. And so even when the stakes are very high, it's difficult to get agencies to do things differently. And so overcoming that resistance to evidence-based or evidence-informed policy and practice is a real challenge that I think we need to take on. And the other thing is that there's not a very big focus, as Heather pointed out, on the use of rigorous evaluation. Whether you're taking interventions that are borrowed from another country and bringing them into the Caribbean, or whether it's a homegrown intervention or prevention program, we really need to see a dramatic increase in the extent to which we're evaluating these things to find out if they're working so we can change them if they're not working. And so as Heather mentioned, one of the programs I'm involved in evaluating right now is Cure Violence, a program that was established in Chicago, a public health-based model for reducing gun-related violence, and we're doing a very intensive evaluation of that in the Port of Spain metropolitan area. In Trinidad and Tobago, we expect to have results over the next few months, and that will be really helpful for trying to figure out whether this is an initiative that should be implemented elsewhere, and even if it should be, whether there need to be any changes. And so this is the kind of thinking that I think needs to be much more apparent as we do policy making and practice around crime and violence in the Caribbean. I'm going to make just a couple more points before I close with regard to some implications for action. One is that I've observed in the Caribbean over the years a very strong sort of dedication to the idea that if we increase the severity of penalties, we can reduce crime. This makes the headlines in most Caribbean countries. Over the years, I've seen lots and lots of headlines across the countries included in this study about if we just increase the severity of penalties, if we bring back corporal punishment of offenders, if we increase the use of the death penalty, if we increase the length of prison sentences. And all of these make good sense But one of the things that we know from criminology is that the severity of the penalty is not the only thing that's important for deterring offending. What is really important is the probability that a penalty will be received at all and the swiftness with which the punishment will be carried out. And so my recommendation to folks in the region is to really concentrate a lot more on those two things. As Heather pointed out, detection rates are quite low in a lot of these countries. And so when you have offenders who are walking around with the sense that they're very unlikely to receive a penalty, and even if they do, it will be delayed by many years due to procedural issues and moving these cases forward, then those penalties are unlikely to serve as effective deterrents. And so concentrating on improving those clearance rates and conviction rates from a deterrence perspective is a really important thing. Another point is that I've seen in these nations a tendency to want to search for silver bullet solutions, usually overseas, and borrowing practices from other countries that are believed to be effective. Sometimes this works, but oftentimes what we find is that when the solution that's borrowed from another country is brought into the Caribbean, it either wasn't effective where it came from in the first place, or it's not implemented appropriately once it's brought into the Caribbean. It's really difficult. There's a whole literature on this called policy transfer. It's really difficult to take these reforms and move them from one place to another, but when we do it, we have to make sure it's an effective program first of all, and if it is an effective program, we have to put a lot of effort into implementing it with fidelity, and that's the place where a lot of these efforts fail. Next, and I think very related to that, is we often focus on building effective institutions, police and courts and forensics and these kinds of things, but we see less of a focus on building effective systems. And so a lot of the initiatives that I've observed over the years, I've seen fall apart in the spaces between systems. So do we have forensic facilities that are working appropriately with police and with prosecutors? Do we have courts that are working effectively with these other systems? Do we have prisons that are working effectively with police, for instance, when we have people who are being put back out on the street at the completion of their sentences? So we have a lot of these sort of systemic issues that don't get a lot of attention, and they're really important if we're really interested in reducing violence. And finally, I started off by mentioning deterrence, and so there's a very strong tendency in the region to focus pretty heavily on deterrence and to ignore other things that can be much more effective, and these were pretty prominent. These other types of programs are pretty prominent in this report. We need to balance prevention efforts with people who are not yet criminally involved, intervention efforts with people who are criminally involved, but we're talking intervention efforts where we're not necessarily talking about deterrence here, but working with people who are already criminally involved to try to pull them back out. For instance, getting gang members back out of gangs, getting people who are involved in violence in gangs to not behave violently anymore. These kinds of interventions are really important. And so while there's lots of talk about deterrence or suppression, we really need to have a much more balanced conversation about prevention, intervention, and suppression. And I'll conclude there, as I began, by congratulating the team who put this really ambitious report together on a tremendous accomplishment. And I hope it contributes to a much needed conversation about the use of data, the use of information to make healthier decisions about crime and justice in the Caribbean. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maguire. Now we're going to turn to Moises Schwartz. He's the Caribbean Regional Economic Advisor in the Caribbean Country Department at the Inter-American Development Bank. This will close out the formal portion of the presentations, and I encourage you to send in questions so that we can launch straight into questions, although we're going to have some special guests in the room to open the questions, but we'll turn to Mr. Schwartz. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased also to be here to talk about this book, Restoring Paradise in the Caribbean. First of all, as the previous panelist, I would like also to congratulate Heather and Inder as well as the rest of contributors and authors for this very difficult but very interesting work. It's a very difficult topic to bring to the table, and specifically because the region doesn't look that well. But this is part of the efforts of the Inter-American Development Bank to stimulate dialogue and to try to find solutions to difficult problems. So we hope to initiate a dialogue with the aim of seeking solutions. So this is a dialogue with country authorities, governments, parliaments, citizens, and society in general. So hopefully we would be able to bring this to a policy discussion and try to find some solutions to these difficult issues. The study is very broad, since they analyze both the social implications of crime as well as some of the economic implications. So my intention would be to stress a little bit more on the economic side, given that the previous panelists talk much more on the criminality or criminology of these issues. So I'll try to base a little bit more emphasis on the cost of crime that is presented in the book, and additional comments related to the economics of crime. So the book covers different topics, and one way of trying to solve a problem is, first of all, to understand the problem. So I think they do a very good job in trying to understand the problem. And then they move on to try to measure the problem. So once you understand and you measure the problem, so you know the magnitude of the issue you are dealing with, so there is a possibility to look for an understanding and how to solve this difficult issue. And they also cover some of the elements of cost and consequences of crimes, and some policy implications and recommendations. More of a cultural or sociological aspect of the study is a very troubling finding that there seems to be relatively high tolerance for both intimate partner violence against women and violence against children. So this is more of a sociological or cultural aspect that I think you deal very carefully with this, and proper solutions need to be found to this difficult problem. Focusing a little bit more on the cost of crime, there is an interesting chapter by Heitman and Torre. Basically, they follow what they call an accounting methodology, basically trying to compute some of the perhaps more easy to detect costs that are related to crime. They classify the cost of crime in 3 different categories. One is the cost incurred by the government. So this includes the cost of the judiciary system, the provision of police services, and the administration of prisons. So I guess these are relatively easy to compute once you have access to the data, of course. Another element of the cost incurred are the costs incurred by the private sector. So this includes the expenditure by firms and households on crime prevention, like security services, and the social cost of crime that would include the foregone income from homicides, persons in jail, and other crime, and other types of crimes. So these costs altogether, these authors present what they call a conservative estimate, and they say that this amounts to a total of 3 percentage points of annual GDP for the whole region. To put this in perspective, so this is similar to what the region spends annually on infrastructure. Another chapter that is also related to the cost of crime by Inder, Heather, and Camilo Pecha, they compute the costs more with an economic perspective in mind. So they try to compute some of the effects of crime on economic growth, tourism, fear, emigration, and life satisfaction. With respect to the effects of crime on growth, they conclude that the growth for the region could have been 1.1% higher annually had the homicide rate in the region matched the world average. And using the same methodology, they conclude that if the homicide rate were reduced to the global average, this would have implied an increase of 2.1% in annual tourism arrival. On fear and insecurity of crime, they acknowledge the existence of these costs, but it's certainly very difficult to measure those. So they use some surveys, and at least they mention the existence of this cost, and it's difficult to compute them, but there is an acknowledgement that all of these costs exist. Related to the above, there is an interesting discussion about fear and insecurity, not only prevalent in households and individuals who are worried about their neighborhoods or even decide to emigrate, but it's also relevant to analyze the effect of fear on alternative or other possibilities of investment that have been kind of lost, kind of an opportunity or foregone investments or opportunity cost and capital flight that the book actually doesn't really cover, even though there is kind of an indication that these costs are also present. So the estimate of 3% of GDP, I would say, is in the lower band of what we are talking about. But this opportunity cost that I'm referring to simply has to do with the fact that many firms might decide to emigrate to other countries, or some other firms might simply prefer to find other destinations instead of a crime-afflicted region. Talking about the Caribbean as a whole, that it's very intensive in the tourism industry, so one could simply envision a case where an hotel chain simply looks for another destination in the Caribbean that it's not affected as much with crime in comparison to another country in the region, or they would simply move to a different region in the world because they might prefer not to deal with this issue. So there are many costs that are very difficult to compute, but they are present and they are prevalent, and something needs to be done about that. They make, as I mentioned before, they make this important distinction between crime and the fear of crime, and one needs to keep in mind that there might be different policies to address both of them. Reducing crime does not necessarily reduce the fear of crime. So even if policies are successful in reducing the rate of crime, it might take a long time to reduce the fear of crime. And if the fear of crime is still prevalent and present, so many economic decisions would be altered and would be different, and the cost might be significant. The study is broad in its coverage, addresses several issues related to crime and violence that need to be tackled from different perspectives. So we have the sociological, cultural element, but we also have the economic perspective that needs to be taken into consideration. So policies that address the problem should be targeted and consider all these difficult angles. So it's not only punishment, as the previous speaker mentioned, but also education, incentives, and providing better opportunities for people in general. To put this in context, in terms of economic theory a little bit, there is a very famous article by Gary Becker, a famous economist and Nobel laureate. In 1968, he wrote a very revolutionary article that has become kind of authoritative theory on crime and economics. So this article is titled Crime and Punishment, an Economic Approach. And as I said, it was written in 1968. And one of his main arguments is that criminals are rational individuals, and they are just like everyone else. They are like ordinary citizens seeking to maximize their own well-being, but through illegal instead of legal means. So this Becker model gives us very interesting ideas. So one can deter crime in very different ways: punishment, education, incentives, better alternatives to education. So one needs to take all of this into consideration and try to affect incentives that people face. Only when one affects incentives, we will be in a better position to deter crime. The previous panelist mentioned this idea that it's not only increasing the punishment or having more of a severe punishment that will deter crime, but also the likelihood of being caught or the likelihood of receiving a penalty. So I would say that it would be interesting to go back to the 1960s, to all these economic ideas that were put in place so many years ago and try to craft a policy agenda for the region that addresses different solutions to the crime problem. And Heather and Inder mentioned some initiatives that are in place and are also in process to be implemented, but perhaps one needs a much more thorough and comprehensive analysis of different measures that would affect costs, that would affect incentives, and would affect behavior of people. And perhaps that would help us move in the right direction. So this is where I would stop, and hopefully we can have an interesting discussion. And I guess, and again, I would like to congratulate Heather on this very magnificent and interesting book. Thank you.
Thank you, Moises. And yes, there's a lot of food for thought around the table here. And so I want to take, to start off this portion of the webinar, I just want to take a quick moment to introduce some of the guests we have around the table. We have Ambassador Thelma Philip Brown, who is the Ambassador of St. Kitts and Nevis. We have Ambassador Anton Edmonds, who is the Ambassador of St. Lucia. Ambassador Eugene Nuri, who is the Ambassador for the Bahamas. We have Ambassador Selwyn Hart, the Ambassador for Barbados. We also have with us online, we have Ambassador Anthony Philip Spencer of Trinidad and Tobago, and joining us is the Security Cooperation Specialist at Trinidad and Tobago, Heather Wallen. So I want to thank all of you who have come to participate, and I do want to allow the ambassadors to maybe make a couple of comments about some of the discussion and what you're hearing, and maybe who would like to take the lead on this? Maybe Ambassador Hart? You? No, let me let Anton take it. Go ahead, Anton.
Very interesting, and thanks to the authors. I actually have a question, so no statement per se. Question of recidivism. Is that something that maybe I had missed, or something that you've touched? I know it ties into elements as to, you know, how rapidly the system, you know, prosecutes people and that sort of stuff. But the issue of recidivism is one which I think a lot of the countries struggle with. And if we talk about people being repeat offenders, and we're talking about folks being repeatedly abused, especially when we're looking at sort of in family or in community engagements, that's something that I'm very curious as to what the sense is on that.
Ambassador, do you have any questions? Do you have any questions?
I don't have a, not so much a question. I have a lot to say in terms of the tolerance in our countries for crime. And I noted the book, I noted earlier, it's Restoring Paradise in the Caribbean. And I wonder if it was ever a paradise, and if paradise is in the eyes of the beholder. You come and you see the beautiful beaches. There's a saying that says blood is already on the ground. And we are actually born in violence and shaped in abuse. One of the reasons it is said why Alexander Hamilton never mentioned his early years is the kind of abuse he saw on the plantations of these countries. Nevis has the record for blows given to a slave, a female slave, 292, a male slave, 365, which means they were dead, probably, before the last blow was struck. We have a place you could drive around St. Kitts, and you reach a place called Bloody Point. That's where the English and the French got together and massacred a host of Kalinaga people. And so violence has been a part of us. That is regrettable and is not to say, but I think we as a people have to understand and go through, understand why our tolerance for violence. I was born in one of the most violent and depraved parts of the country, a ghetto area, a little tiny house, and every day this gentleman will come from the rum shop, and once he's passed through, we know he's going to beat his wife. Okay. And we'd all go, and it was like nothing to us. And I look back and now, I wonder how did we do that? But it was just all another day, And so what happens now, support part of that and our tolerance for it, we have to explore that. We have to deal with our history. We have to explore it. We have to look at the public health issues, the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, abuse, physical, mental, spiritual, assault, criminality, all those things. Is the ACE pyramid that outlines it. And we have to look at crime as a public health issue. But there are some other things that concern me. Okay, so they fought. Every day I saw a fight growing up, every day. Sticks, stones, bottles. But there were no guns, and we don't make guns. And so that, I think, is missing. Guns, we don't make guns. And I don't hear these studies looking at guns coming into the region. Drugs. The drugs are transshipped. We don't produce those drugs, and they are destined for some place. So I would really like us to look at those things. We talk about poverty. They come to neighborhoods which I grew up in. And these drugs, and yes, it was alcohol, now it's these hard drugs. And these are things that I think we ought to be looking at. Yes, we have to do our part. But they're saying the other thing is we have small countries with little or no natural resources. Our human resources are our most important resource, and yes, we have to look to develop them. But then when we face services, we have to depend on services. And so some of us turn to financial services, and then we get labeled tax havens, and then we lose correspondent banking. And all these things put more economic pressure on us, and that is external. And then you have people, as you say, a lot of people migrate for these very reasons, and they go, and some of them and their children go away, and they're out for 3/4 of their lives. They learn things in the States or in England or wherever, they get into trouble, and then you post them back home in a small community where they just let loose all the tricks of the trade. So I hope we can also, when we're doing this study, we have a lot of work to do. There's no doubt, and I think we have to start with acknowledging why we are so tolerant of violence, especially violence against women. It has to start with us looking at violence against women, and especially adolescent girls and these type of things. We have a lot of work to do. But I think when we do these studies, we also must look at the responsibility of the outside world, because you may come and you look at it and it looks like a paradise. But for these people, it has never been.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's interesting because you actually touched on a number of the questions that have been sent in by the audience. So we will put a pin in there because I think there are a lot of important issues you raised. And maybe I'll turn to Ambassador Nouri. Do you have any comments or questions that you would like to make before we turn to the panelists?
Yes, thank you very much. Can I be heard? If I listen to, well, first of all, thank you for this marvelous book. I've been skimming through it, looking at both the positive and the negative points. But I think that one of the issues that Ambassador Philip Brown just touched on them, but most of these studies leave out totally the history of the reality of the Caribbean. It is impossible to study, for example, Britain or the United States or Canada without looking at in depth at the history of how they came to be what they are. But when we talk about the Caribbean, we tend only to look at what I call the sociological elements of it. For example, the title of this book is fascinating to me. It says, Restoring Paradise in the Caribbean. But what paradise, and for whom that paradise? Are these the little naked children running around with fishing rods and the tourists taking pictures of them, and this is the paradise? No. I think we've got to see ourselves in the Caribbean as part of a world situation of competitive economics. But people, and it's very fascinating, I think Ambassador Philip Brown touched on it. There are people who, in fact, when we try to do things in the Caribbean that they initiated in other countries on economic levels, they create all kinds of running, what I call the dog and the rabbit at the track. In other words, if you go to Miami and you look at horse, rabbit and dog racing, whenever the dog begins to catch up to the rabbit, the starter, or whatever you call that person, simply makes the rabbit go faster, and the dog will never catch up, except in our case in the Caribbean, sports. For some reason, sports is dominated in many aspects of it, especially track and field, basketball, football, in every major country in the world, by people who are Afro-descendants. Now, the reality is that looking at crime, it seems to me that you've got to, first of all, define what crime, whose crime, but above all, why. So I think that what we need to do is to define what paradise, who, and for whom. And secondly, how do these come to be? You've got to know those not just objectively and academically, but in very real human terms. I believe, and I've been saying this for many years, everyone in the Caribbean wants to be either middle class or upper class. And I think the gentleman touched on that in his statement. We simply do not feel that we are any different from anybody else, and we use the same methods as other people. Now, I don't have the figures in front of me, but I'm just wondering, if you take what group of people in the Caribbean are most prone to the crimes, committing of crimes, I don't think that they're any different in terms of moral or what have you things than anybody else anywhere in the world. In some countries, like the United States, for example, Hollywood even magnifies, idolizes the mafia and all those groups like that. They're made into movies that make billions of dollars because people would like to be like those people. But of course, you know the rest of it, and they are protected in high places, etc. So, I mean, I could go on all day, but I'm going to stop. But I just want to make this point clear. We need to define and recognize that Caribbean peoples are no different from any other people in the world in terms of their desires. But what they find, and this is where the tolerance part comes in that Dr. Philip Brown mentioned, what they find is that external forces using local authorities create laws, etc., which define what we do as criminal or whatever it is, whatever it is, as opposed to other people where they find other definitions. So we need to find, and it's fascinating that you're talking about paradise and banking. It's fascinating. When we tried, I know in the Bahamas, for example, I couldn't open a bank. The laws of the Bahamas clearly state, and without any contradiction, that Bahamians cannot own banks. They can own shares in banks, but they cannot own banks. There's groups to which I belong, people have tried to form banks for years. And the outside forces put it in such a way that we cannot own banks. So some people turn to criminal means of attempting through lotteries and other things, the achieving of these things. So there it is, food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Nouri. If we could ask Ambassador Hart of Barbados, please, to make some comments.
I'll be very brief. And first of all, Sally, thanks for the invitation. And it's really good to see the panelists again. And I'm sure they will. They can anticipate what I will say. First and foremost, as the custodian of the Barbados brand in the United States, I can assure everyone that Barbados remains a paradise. One of the concerns that I've expressed previously, and we see this in many of the publications from the IDB, is that you make very sweeping generalizations about the Caribbean. And on the issue of crime and violence, there are pretty major differences in the level of crime and violence in each of the countries. And there are also different cultural realities in each of the countries. And it's unfortunate that we continue to hear this very broad generalization about the Caribbean. The homicide rate in Washington, D.C. is 2.5 times to 3 times higher than in Barbados, right? And Barbados is safer than virtually every major city in the United States. So, we really have to avoid making these very sweeping generalizations. I fully agree that the issue of crime and violence is a problem in the Caribbean, and it must be tackled through many of the strategies that are recommended individually and also collectively, given the closeness of the countries and also the tradition that we've had in terms of freedom of movement. The final factor or issue that I would like to raise is that when we're looking at reports like this, which some of our competitors can use in pretty negative ways, we really need to present a more balanced picture. There are many external factors, not only internal, many external factors driving the increase in crime and violence throughout the Caribbean. As one of the ambassadors said, I think Ambassador Philip Brown said, they don't make guns in the Caribbean. These guns are coming from external sources. They're organized transnational criminal networks in other parts of our region, which traffic drugs, guns, etc., and they use our marine and land space as a transshipment point. And thirdly, the issue of criminal deportees, which is another external factor that I think that we need to look at as well. So again, my 2 points that I've raised with you previously, we really need to look at the Caribbean in a differently, not as that the situation is identical in every country. And secondly, we also need to present a more balanced picture by looking at some of the external factors. But in closing, Barbados remains a paradise.
Thank you, Ambassador Hart. On the line we have Ambassador Anthony Philip Spencer of Trinidad and Tobago, who wanted to contribute to the discussion. So we will turn over to Ambassador Hart.
Spencer.
So, sorry, Ambassador Philip Spencer, sorry. Ambassador, can you hear us? Okay, I think we're having some issues getting that connection. Am I muted or unmuted?
Yeah.
Okay. We're having some problems making that connection, so we'll try and figure out. And let's see if Therese Turner-Jones.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Perfect. Yes, we can.
Perfect. So first of all, Sally, let me thank you for, again, the partnership with CCAA and for hosting this in your office. And welcome all the ambassadors that are in the room. This is very, very rich discussion. I mean, I want to say just the question of paradise or no paradise. I think what this publication reveals to us is, in a sense, we know that there are a lot of social issues arising out of our macroeconomic situation in the Caribbean that we have to come to grips with. We can't sort of pretend that crime doesn't exist. The crime is there, the data shows it. And even Barbados has crime that is, I lived in Barbados for 3 years, so it is a paradise, I would agree. It's a very beautiful place, but so is my country, Bahamas. But, you know, we have to sort of step back from what it is we're selling. And I think the paradise we're selling to the rest of the world, if we weren't selling that paradise, economic activity for thousands of people in the region wouldn't exist. So whether it's a paradise in a broader sense for every single citizen in the Caribbean is another story, and there are all kinds of historical reasons for that. But let's face it, I mean, you think if you were to do a random survey just walking outside Sally's office right now and ask anyone on the street what comes to mind if you said Barbados, Bahamas, Jamaica, paradise is probably what will come out of their mouths. Jamaica, you may hear Bob Marley, marijuana, and so on, but I think the region is very much associated with a paradise, and we have been selling that for decades. But I think, you know, we as people working in the development field are looking at a whole range of issues, and I think this publication gives us some insight as to some areas for further work. And it's not a perfect publication, but I think the evidence is very well laid out, and we have to somehow, as policymakers, try to help every single country identified in the report deal with some of these issues. I think some of the recommendations lend themselves to pretty straightforward solutions, and others are much more complex. But what I think is really of value is what has already started happening this week, which is a rich dialogue across the region on this topic of crime and violence in the Caribbean. And I also think it's very helpful to have the insight of people like you in the room saying, and there are other issues that we haven't covered, like the drug trade and the trade in guns. No, we don't produce arms, but for some reason, we're met with guns in the Caribbean. So that brings up other issues. And so people like you who have connections with the U.S. government, it should form part of your dialogue. And that, you know, organizations like Impacts under the OAS, we need to figure out ways to really put these issues higher up on the policy agenda so that we get some action. It should really inform the dialogue between the region and the U.S. government, because the transshipment of drugs through the region has been going on for decades. Some of us are consumers of these illicit drugs, but I mean, our societies are being affected, and I think that comes out in the data. So I think it brings a lot of fresh ideas and evidence to dealing with our problems, and I think the IDB should be very proud of this report. And hopefully, 10 years from now, where we can see that we've made a difference in terms of addressing this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Therese. And just for the benefit of the audience, Therese Turner-Jones is the General Manager of Caribbean Country Department at the Inter-American Development Bank, and we appreciate the comments and the input. We did hear from Ambassador Philip Spencer. He is on his way over. He's going to try and get here so he can talk in person, which is great. So we've had a really wide range of questions. Like I said, some of the questions were brought up again by some of the ambassadors in the room. We've had some very specific questions about the impact of drugs on crime in the region. There have also been some very specific questions about the gender-based violence and the impact of violence on women and how that impacts the study. There has been a more very specific question about Montego Bay, Jamaica, and how Montego Bay is transforming in terms of crime, and wondering whether there's been any looking at that. So I think I don't want to take too much time because we only have about 10-15 minutes left, and we do want to leave some time for the ambassador. So if I could maybe turn to Heather and have your initial feedback on all the discussions and questions that have taken place, so that we can get some initial input.
Sure, certainly. So I think I'll start with the question on recidivism, and I think this is a very important question. The publication does not cover recidivism specifically because for many reasons. One, it's something that's very difficult to measure. There's not a common agreement within the United States, for example, let alone amongst countries around the world, of what recidivism means and how you measure it. But recidivism essentially is the idea that some individuals will repeat their crimes, and it is a very important issue for us to be dealing with, and certainly I think there are two ways that the Caribbean needs to be focusing, or there's areas for increased focus in order to reduce recidivism, and one of them is first of all diversion away from the criminal justice system for juveniles, for low-level offenses in the first place. We know that when we put juveniles or low-level offenders together with high-level offenders in prisons, this is almost never beneficial, and almost certainly they're more likely to come out worse off than they went in. So diversion programs and strengthening those diversion programs are really an important piece to reducing recidivism and reducing crime and violence in general. And then second of all, better reintegration and support programs for outgoing offenders. So often, unfortunately, and then this is the case not only in the Caribbean but many countries around the world, those individuals who are in prison for a crime are let out, and they go back to those very same problem places that we talked about, with very little, neighborhood support, and with all of the same risk factors that they started out with, let alone that now they have been labeled a criminal. So it becomes very difficult, and so specific reintegration programs that start from before release. And then there's been some work on this within the corrections facilities. I think Trinidad and Tobago is experimenting with a case management system to really look at the profiles of each individual prisoner and what their needs are in terms of reintegration after they leave. We'll have to see how that initiative pans out. But this is a very important part of the puzzle here, and that often gets the least amount of attention. In terms of some of the external factors that influence crime and violence in the Caribbean, absolutely, I think there's no doubt about it that there are external factors here. There is certainly the aspect of guns is mentioned within the publication. There's a whole chapter on this, and we do, as was mentioned, the Caribbean does not produce guns. We find that, in fact, there's data showing a good portion in certain countries that we have data for, Jamaica, Bahamas, and Trinidad and Tobago, that a very large portion of those guns are coming from the United States. Where we're able to trace them back to their origins, and so that is certainly an issue. There's a corridor that's been well established, guns and drugs, and certainly with the drug passage through the Caribbean, there have been consequences over time, and we do see the increased homicide rates right around the 80s and 90s, depending on the country. But certainly, easy access to firearms makes violence more lethal, or it can lead to more lethal violence. And these are issues that have to be addressed. Unfortunately, organized crime specifically is not something that we address in this publication. It's difficult to measure, certainly not with victimization surveys, which was our focus in this book. But definitely there is a need there, and I do think that much of this discussion, in fact, around crime and violence in the Caribbean tends to focus perhaps even too much on the aspect of organized crime. And what this book brings is as a new perspective, showing that that yes, organized crime is and gangs are a piece of the puzzle, but there are other aspects of social tolerance for violence here that that we need to be looking at. On the question about gender-based violence specifically, as I mentioned, we don't have good data in the region on gender-based violence, and this is something that the IDB is working on ongoing with countries of the region to implement, as I mentioned, women's health surveys, which are the best way to really understand this phenomenon. And finally, the interregional variation, and this goes to the question of Barbados. It also goes to the specific issue of Montego Bay in Jamaica. You know, a publication like this, essentially, we are trying to look at a regional perspective to see if there's something unique about the Caribbean as a region. So there is a certain amount of generalization. I think if you read the book, you look at the book, you will see there is a good discussion of the variance by country, and certainly Barbados and Suriname have far lower levels of, particularly of homicide, as was mentioned. That said, there is still this high level of violent crime or assault and threat. That crime of assault and threat was higher across even those countries that have lower homicide rates. So we do see something particularly there, even for Barbados. And one of the interesting aspects, I think, going back to the guns question, is we see in both Barbados and Suriname far lower levels of homicides committed with guns. So there's a lot lower levels of firearm violence in these countries, which may be also significantly contributing to lower homicide rates across the board. In terms of Montego Bay and the phenomenon of sort of this is a migration of crime from Kingston metropolitan area in Jamaica to now some of the more western areas, in Montego Bay specifically is you know, a large tourist destination. We're seeing some increasing levels of homicides in and around that area. It's a very recent phenomenon, so it is actually not covered in the book. Very recent and very specific to Jamaica. But I think you do see, there was a question about lotto scamming as well in Jamaica, which is now the use of, well, it's certainly a new criminal enterprise that we're seeing in Jamaica. And the question is, I think, here is that is this something really different than what we've seen before, or is this just a new means with the same types of crime and violence that we've seen for many years in Jamaica? And I think it may just be a new tool or a new means instead of, you know, drugs. Lotto scamming has become the new focus of choice for many criminal groups in Jamaica. I'm happy to get more in depth if anyone wants to email me about those specific issues.
Just a quick question. In as much as the primary focus, clearly and obviously, I mean, is the IDB. So the focus has really been on IDB member states. How I'm not going to use the word credible because I believe it's very important, but can we assume that we just take this and apply this to the rest of the Caribbean, or not? Or should I not even be sitting here listening to this because I'm not part of an IDB member country?
So should I answer that, or do we have more questions?
We actually have Ambassador Philip Spencer is now on a different computer, and so we'll invite him to make his comments, and then we'll just have you close. I think this time has flown, so let's turn to the Ambassador, and then we'll go to Anton's question. Ambassador, hey, we're hearing you now.
Great, good. I decided let me test the technology on another means, another platform, another device. So first, let me begin by, of course, extending congratulations to CCAA for organizing this, and for the presenters, thanks very much. I want to also commend the team that worked on this report, this document, because data is important, and it's good that we have the opportunity now to balance the sense of what's going on in the region in terms of crime and violence by science. But let me begin by making this observation. I always remember, you know, there's a spectrum through which issues must be addressed. So there's a descriptive discourse, then there's the explicative or analytical discourse, and then there's the prescriptive aspect. And let me say this, data describes, decision makers prescribe. And the region will do well now, I think, and will benefit from this data, which has continued to give us perhaps more clear or clearer description of the challenge. But still remaining is the need for a policy-driven and strategic approach in the region. I think the other ambassadors that spoke before addressed sufficiently the issue of, you know, this concept of the region as a paradise in terms of our history and our structural issues, our geopolitical issues, all of those things. Those things, I think, has been, you know, it's been admitted that they would need some further attention. And really and truly, the region is a paradise for criminals and businesses. You know, the movie speaks of Pirates of the Caribbean, not Pirates of the Mediterranean. And so, from an economic standpoint, and when we look at the economic cost now, I've framed the term transshipment economies, and therefore in a world of transnational organized crime. The region naturally attracts a higher than average level of transnational organized crime for the capacity of the countries to address it. And really and truly, technology now, and I think the last commenter was referring to that, is really TOC on steroids. The platform of technology has given transnational organized crime steroids. But let me address two aspects that I don't think have been covered yet, and that's the issue of there's a need for security sector reform. This sectoral approach, and this is where I go back to the need for a policy-driven and strategic approach. This is where I go back to the importance of taking this very valuable data and the science done here through an explicative or analytical process that enables prescription by decision makers. And that perspective, though, that policy perspective on addressing security in the region, which will address crime and violence, needs to be a very sectoral perspective. I refer to see, stop, catch, and correct. The region is weak on seeing. Its intelligence capacity is weak. The region does not have a sufficient understanding of the stop element, defense. It doesn't understand how to integrate defense into the broader security sector framework, policy framework or strategic framework. And then when you go to the catch, which is the law enforcement and the criminal justice, I think this is where you've been strongest. This is where this study dealt most and really was able to provide a lot of data. And then we really need to change the concept of prisons to correction. It's not punishment. When someone is prosecuted, yes, you want to, there's a fine, there's a sentence, but at the end of that process of having spent time in prison, it must be correction. We don't even refer to it as correction in most of the countries in the region. We still talk about prison. And finally, you know, I think it's time we look at some of the institutional weaknesses within our framework of the sector. Ambassador Philip Brown spoke about issues of education and all those things. We have now in the region a gap in, I think in the United States they refer to that phase as middle school, between age 11 and 15 thereabout, where when students come out of the primary school system, they seem to have these years when they're neither sufficiently parented and neither sufficiently engaged by community activity and the school curriculum. And then they're expected to jump back on the education system. If we look at where most of the recruiting for gangs and all of the other youth violence is evolving, that's the window. But again, if we go back to the strategic and more policy-driven approach that looks at the entire sector, and included in the sector must be the non-traditional things. The seeing problems in children in school is part of intelligence. So intelligence is not only looking for criminals, it's looking for the children early ages, and that's the public health approach I think Ambassador Philip Brown was talking about. The children who come from communities or homes where they are clearly going to be more vulnerable to being invited into a life of crime and violence. The issue of the tolerance, I think, is well dealt with, but again, the data shows what's the explanation, what's the prescription. Thanks very much. I'm going to stop there. Of course, you know I could speak for much more time on this, but let me just thank you for giving me a few minutes to contribute to the discourse. I think it's very valid. I support the comments made by Ambassador Hart and Ambassador Nuri and Ambassador Philip Brown, and of course the questions from Ambassador Edmonds are very on point. I'll continue to listen. Sorry I couldn't make it. Thanks for the time to contribute. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. And yes, we also miss having you with us, but glad you were able to join us online. We'll let Heather close. We're now a little bit over time, so we'll let Heather close, see whether Moises and Professor Maguire have any closing statements, but I'll turn over to Heather.
Sure, and I think that the last remark from the Ambassador was actually the perfect closing to this discussion. Much of it I couldn't have said better myself. In terms of the book covering certain IDB countries, this is true. The member countries that we've covered here are, and the countries that we've covered are IDB member countries, and there's a good reason for that, which is that it allows us to have dialogue with those countries and be able to capture this kind of data. So, you know, and I want to say that I think to address both comments that does this apply to the rest of the Caribbean? We don't know. And that's the importance of data. So what is shown here in this publication is exactly that. It's the data for those countries. I would say that other countries in the region also need their own data, generation, and we need to be looking at the specific data for each particular context.
IDB need to. I know.
And I think there's room for some partnerships there, certainly in terms of the technical aspects of designing these surveys and implementing them. There's a lot of knowledge sharing that can be done. But going back to the importance of data, and I really think that we need to be commending all of the countries that were involved in this study and their governments for coming on board and working with the IDB to generate this type of data. It's not easy to face sometimes. It can be a bitter pill to swallow, but as several of the other people in the discussion today have mentioned, how important it is to have the data to be able to begin to diagnose or describe the problem so that specifically policymakers can make better informed decisions. And we hope that this data, in fact, I'd like to mention that all of the data, the raw data, is available to anyone who is interested in using it, to academics, the public, just policymakers on the website caribbeaneconomics.org. And there's a good reason for that. We want the data to be out there. We want it to be used. It should go far beyond this publication. And I'd like to thank everyone for being here and for listening to this discussion today.
Thank you, Heather. Moises?
Sure. Well, just very briefly, I would see this initiative as a first step. So it's not the end of the process. It's not that the IDB and Heather in particular produced this interesting book and that's the end of the discussion. It's quite the contrary. So this is a way of starting a discussion with countries, with society in general. There are issues that are not covered in the book that were raised this morning. There are issues that could be handled differently, but the idea is to initiate a dialogue on a very difficult topic and hopefully try to find solutions to this difficult problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Maguire?
Yes, thank you. I'll just be very brief. First of all, I appreciate the comments from all the ambassadors. I was busily taking notes, learning from each of them as they made their comments on the report. And like Moises, I'd just like to say that I view this as just one in a series of, I'm hopeful that this is just one in a series of steps as we move toward building a science of preventing crime and violence in the Caribbean, and that 5 or 10 years down the road, we have longitudinal data that are helping us answer with a lot of specificity, are things getting better, are things getting worse, and exactly in which ways are those trends pointing. And if that ends up being the case, then I think we can see data being very useful in informing policy. So thank you, folks. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Maguire. So we will close off now. I want to thank all the speakers, to Dr. Maguire, Moises Schwartz, Heather Sutton. I want to thank the ambassadors and special guests who made it here today. I want to thank Therese Turner-Jones and Ambassador Philip Spencer, who called in. The presentation will be available. There is a link to the publication itself available online. The webinar will be posted on CCAA's website and on our YouTube channel. I want to thank all of the audience that took time out of their morning to join us for this very important discussion. And I wish all of you a great weekend, thanks to the IDB, of course, and we look forward to our next webinar together. Take care. Bye-bye.
And let me